Maryland. You did it too.
On purpose.
And my name's Fred. We've got friends who have names that start with M, and we both get them mixed up, especially in the same room. If your name's Marilyn, her name's Marianne, I'd call you Marianne.
Okay, we're up to speed.
Great. Well, good evening. I'm John Marshall Cheatwood from the heart of the horse and cattle country in Warrenton, Virginia. I grew up here, went to high school here, and I learned how to tell stories, and I've been telling stories for a long time. Well, what kind of stories? What I really like to tell are folk tales, and I tell some Appalachian folklore, but I also tell some Uncle Remus stories. But you know what? Nobody bounced me on their knee and told me these stories. I read them out of a book. And I've read a lot of books that I didn't really find anything that I liked, but I kept looking. And then I found something that I really liked, and that's what I call a story that moves me. And I tell you what, it's really wonderful when a story moves you and you become what I call gloriously alive. And you just have all your energy and your wits about you. And there's some stories out there that were written by other people. I haven't really written much on my own. But some of those authors are people like, well, Kenneth Grahame. Kenneth Grahame wrote a book called The Wind in the Willows. And it starts off kind of like this, at least this is how I like to tell it. The mole had been working busily all the morning, spring cleaning his little home, first with brooms and dusters, and a bucket of whitewash, and steps and ladders and chairs. When something up above began to call him imperiously, and he scraped and scratched and scrabbled and scrooged, and he scrooged and scraped and scrabbled and scratched, until pop! His nose popped out into the great meadow. And this is when I like to tell you about Moly and Badger and Ratty, and also about Toad, the magnificent Mr. Toad. And you know, you can see him swinging from the chandeliers in his mansion and having the first automobile in town, driving all around, just tearing up the roads. Well, that's how I like to tell the stories. Sometimes I tell them exactly as they're written, and other times I try to blow the breath of life into those stories. And then there are people that will call for Rudyard Kipling. Now, Rudyard Kipling lived over there in India, and he knew a lot about wild and exotic animals. So he wrote these stories called the Just So stories. And in one of those, he talked about the elephant's child. You see, he starts off with this magnificent language. He says things like, "In the high and far-off times, O best beloved, there lived the elephant's child, whose nose was no bigger than a boot, although much more useful. One day the elephant's child went down to the banks of the great gray, green, greasy Limpopo River, all set about with fever trees. And when the elephant's child was down to the river, he was about to dip his nose into the water to take a drink, when the little colo bird up in the tree said, 'Stop, or you'll vitiate your future career.'" Don't you just like that word, vitiate? Well, the elephant's child paid no mind to the colo bird, and he dipped his nose into the water, and who should he see but the large patent leather ulster, also known as the crocodile. But the elephant's child wasn't paying any attention to the colo bird, and so he went ahead and had the drink of water. And when he dipped his nose into the water, the crocodile snapped his snout and stretched and stretched and stretched it until the little elephant's child said, "Stop, you're hurting me." Well, there's much more to know about that little elephant's child, and if you ask your librarian about the Just So stories, they'll tell you where to find them. There are also stories by a guy named, oh gosh, what was his name? He wrote Alice in Wonderland. Lewis Carroll? Lewis Carroll. Did you know he was a mathematician? He was really good with numbers. But there's one poem in there. I don't like poems all that much. I bet you don't either. But maybe you do. But this poem, it was about the Jabberwocky. He says, "The Jabberwocky, beware the jaws that catch and the claws that snatch, and shun the frumious bandersnatch. Swish, swish, calloo, callay, he took his vorpal sword in hand." And there's all this stuff about the Jabberwocky. And then there's the story about the walrus and the carpenter and how they go down to the beach and they convince the oysters to come walk out with them. You are smiling. Yeah, you remember that one. So, Lewis Carroll, and then we had Rudyard Kipling and Kenneth Grahame. But one of my really favorite ones is a springtime story. Mostly girls like it, but there's stuff there for the guys too. It's called Elsie Pittock Skips in Her Sleep. This lady named Eleanor Farignon wrote it. And it starts off with this little girl who wants to skip. And all of the bigger girls are skipping in the alley and in the street. and she's too little. And so one night her parents wake up hearing slap, 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 slap. She had gotten her father's suspenders, and she was jumping through the long end, and the short end was slap, slap, slap against the floor. She went about 10 times running before she fell, and she bruised her knee, and her daddy saw her, and he picked her up, and he rubbed her knees, and he made her feel better, and her mommy said, "Tomorrow we'll get you a skipping rope." And they did. Well, Elsie Pittock learned to skip so well, she skipped as never so, and I think that Elsie Pittock skipped so good that the fairies heard about her. And so one day, Andy Spandy heard about her, and I think it was Fairy Heels of Lead, who really couldn't skip very much because he had heels of lead. Well, he told Andy Spandy, I know somebody that can skip better than you. She can skip better than anybody. She can skip as never so. And Elsie Pittock skipped and skipped and skipped. And she taught all the other kids to skip too, and she taught them the high skip and the slide skip and the skip all together, and the long skip and the strong skip and the skip all together. And then she taught them Andy Spandy, Sugarty Candy, French Almond Rock, bread and butter for your suppers, all your mother's got. And they did that at double quick time. Well, if you want to know more about these stories, you've got to go talk to your librarian. And the librarian will help you find them in the books. You could also find the stories on my website, but I'm not going to tell you what it is yet.
Cut.